Welcome back, everyone, to the Moms Like Me podcast. Today's guest is absolutely incredible. I feel like she has more credentials than most I speak to. Ashley Jones, she is a grief specialist, a TEDx speaker, a keynote speaker, an author. Ashley, you do all the things on top of running this beautiful and exceptional nonprofit, Memento. I'm so excited to have the opportunity to interview you formally today. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here.
Of course. Ashley, we've known each other for a while now, and I am always inspired by your journey and your story. You truly encapsulate, taking pain and turning that into something beautiful and inspirational for others. For people that don't know your story and Skyler, I'd love for you to share a little bit more about what brought you to this world and to this kind of this calling.
Sure. So my husband and I were surprised with a pregnancy when we were very young. We had been married a year, and we were like, okay, I guess we'll be young parents. We'll get this started early, great. And I had a natural delivery, loved every minute of being pregnant, just really had a great experience and was honored to be a mom and brought Skyler into this world. And then at 1 month old, we noticed something was kind of off. Her right arm would come up like a chicken wing. Weren't really sure what was going on. After a series of events, doctor's visits and testing and diagnosis, we found out she had spinal muscular atrophy, which is a terminal illness. At the time, there was no treatment, definitely no cure. Muscles degenerate, very similar to Lou Gehrig's disease or ALS. And so eventually they'll die, and usually it's lack of breathing, lack of swallow, lack of muscle tone. They can't sit up straight. So our daughter never held her head up. Like we would do tummy time, and that was one of the first signs. Like we would do tummy time, and she wouldn't even be able to lift her head. And I was like, I think she's gonna suffocate in the blankets. Like she's supposed to be lifting up her head. And so I brought that up with a pediatrician because I was like, oh my gosh, like I don't want to have her suffocate in the pillow. What's going on? And even within the first month, he was like, she is getting like a little bit floppier. And he kind of called it floppy baby syndrome, where it's like, there's just no muscle tone. Like, let's figure out what's going on. So long story short, at 2 months old, we got the official diagnosis of SMA, and we were told she would likely not see her first birthday. Yeah. And so then our journey began of anticipatory grief, right? Of like, what do we do looking at this beautiful baby girl who had so much life and so much joy, knowing that she's going to die soon. And so, yeah, we really tried to make the most of our time together. And then she went on hospice for the first time at 10 months old. All the doctors in Atlanta, which we have a good medical system, right? We have so many different hospital systems and researchers, but everyone on our team said, this is it. This is the end, call in hospice. And so we were getting ready to say goodbye. And I called a researcher out in Utah who had dedicated her career to SMA research. And I said, hey, everyone's telling us we can't have her organs donated because they're so bad, but could you potentially use any of her muscle tissue or other things for research for this horrible condition? Like maybe we could help, future babies that way. And she was like, I really appreciate this phone call. Obviously, that's like such a generous offer. But tell me more about your situation. And so through talking to her, she was like, there's more you can do. Like the doctors there just don't know. So with that one phone call, it was like instant karma, right? Like we were getting ready to pull the plug and say goodbye. And that was at 10 months old, and Skyler ended up making it to 21 months old.
Wow.
And so, and at 21 months old, our researcher, doctor, and she took over our healthcare. So it was like telehealth before that was a thing, and she said, I got your care, but when we hit 21 months, she was like, now we're at the end. Right. And so you can, make preparations. But really at that time, it was 2011 when she died. And part of what got me started into all of this was as I was looking into help, right? Like, where can I find support? Where can I find grief resources? What what can I do? It was like, we have prototypes for flying cars. And like our grief stuff is from the dark ages. I was like, what the hell? I was like, this is terrible. Like we have enough technology and enough research and enough brilliant people right now in the world to make this better. And so the more I looked into it, the more I was like, all right, whatever, I'll tackle it. It's fine.
Ashley, I have to pause you there because I think what you said is, one of the most common themes I hear on this podcast is about how you have to become an advocate for your child.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're explaining there is how hard that actually is. You're talking about a diagnosis that is so rare and so unusual that even the doctors didn't know what
Yeah.
options existed. And I think that's just a really good reminder for parents and moms that are listening that to seek outside opinions, to do your own research. Yes, it is so tiring and exhausting, and maybe it feels hopeless. And oftentimes there are people out there in the corners of the universe that knows something that a traditional doctor might not know. And I think that story just encapsulates all that found time, that precious time you had with her. I mean, what a blessing, and what a reminder of constantly needing to challenge what's presented to you, because it's not, I don't believe that any of these people do this out of ill will. They just don't know. These things are complicated. They're super, super rare.
I mean, doctors have so much on their shoulders, obviously with health insurance, right? Because we all know that that's a broken system. That's a whole nother thing. Don't get me started on that. but but also, so the health insurance system is broken, which their hands are tied a lot of times by that. And then also too, like the fear of making a wrong diagnosis or a wrong like plan of action that causes something. Like SMA babies are so fragile. One of the things I realized was, the researcher, because she had seen it so much, like knew what the limits were. But so many doctors in Atlanta didn't know what the limits were. And so they were afraid to test them, right? Because it's like, if you test them and it's wrong, your baby's dead, right? And then it's your fault as a doctor because you push the limits. So I get it. But also, it is so helpful to find the wonderful people in the world who've dedicated their careers to a specific rare condition or a different type of research or whatever. It's truly special. So grateful for those humans.
So before we get into all the incredible work you've done since Skyler's passing, I'm curious to ask you more about kind of your own past. Like, did you ever have anything like this, any sort of trauma, any sort of exposure to rare disease like this? Like, did anything prepare you for what was to come? Or was there ever a sense in your life that this was going to be the type of work that you would pursue?
Back in high school, I would volunteer with the severely handicapped kids at the local elementary school. And it was peer mentorship, is the program that it was called. And honestly, like people are like, oh, wow, you're such a great human. I'm like, I was like, I am a caring, empathetic person, but also I just didn't want to go to school on time. Right. So like I chose peer mentorship for the first class of the day, knowing that I could sleep in a little bit longer. Right. So like, just want to be transparent on that. I am a good human, but also I have ulterior motives of sleeping in. And so I went to peer mentorship, and there were 5 kids in my classroom, or the teacher's classroom, the one that I was volunteering with. And they were all incredibly severely handicapped, like cerebral palsy with deep contractures, epilepsy with like serious seizures during the day. And so I remember sitting there and watching the teacher, and I was just there for an hour, right? And I remember thinking like, holy crap, how do these teachers do it all day, every day? And then how do the parents do it, right? Because these kids get sent home and then the parents are left to care for these kids. And I remember thinking, I mean, I was only 16 at the time. I remember thinking like, oh my gosh, this is such a big burden to carry, right? Like this is really intense and really heavy. And I remember thinking like, God, like if you're there, like I don't want this, right? Like this is not something I want, but like happy to volunteer now,
I want to pay my dues now because this is not something I'm interested in later on in my life. Yeah.
And then I went over to Northern Ireland with short-term missions organization, and we volunteered in the villages where a lot of orphans were running around without homes, without parents, without guidance. And so we had these summer camps for them. And there was a girl with Down syndrome who was a part of our regular programming. I interacted with her quite a bit, and I just remember having this like pit feeling of like, why do I feel like I'm getting prepared for something, of like, and I didn't know if it was going to be special needs. I didn't know what it was, right? But I just knew, like, deep down, this intuitive knowing of like, I'm going to have a heavy load to carry, but I don't know what that is. And I don't know what it's going to look like. And I just remember again saying, God, I don't want it, right? Like, not here for this. Like, I want the easy path. And obviously there were other plans that my deep inner wisdom knew that I was trying to avoid.
It is that's a fascinating story. And just I'm sure as you look back, I'm sure there's mixed emotions and all of that, but it is a telling example of kind of you never know. You never know how the experiences from your past end up shaping the ones that you're going to have in the future.
Yeah.
So when Skylar passed, Ashley, talk to me a little bit about your grief journey. What did that look like? What were the different emotions? And then how did you personally begin to cope in the weeks, months, and years to follow?
Yeah. So I will say, just a quick reference to your prior question of had you experienced loss or trauma before that? So I kind of alluded to like the heaviness and the what could come. But in high school, I also lost two friends to really traumatic, tragic car accidents. I had also lost a grandpa to a heart attack, and my aunt had cancer. And so through my life, I had lost different different grief experiences, right, and different trauma, different losses. And then in college, my dog died. And I say that because a lot of times people dismiss pet loss, but I'm an only child and I got that dog when I was 5 years old. And she was with me through everything, through my parents' divorce, through breakups, through sexual assault, through, like friends backstabbing. She's like with me through all those key, like really hard things that a lot of people go through in their younger years. And so when she died when I was in college, that was also like a huge, deep grief. My aunt, who was my safe person, was also who had cancer. She died when I was in college. And so what I realized was that high school and college, in those losses that I experienced, really didn't create spaces for kids or young adults to know how to grieve. Like when the traumatic car accident that happened in our high school, no one really showed up. And I kind of write about this in my book too, because it was the first time where I realized like, oh, we're all going to die, because just because we're young doesn't mean we're protected. No one's teaching us what to do, right? Like they were like, go to the guidance counselor, but that was it. And I was like, well, like, do we still have to take finals? Like, do we still, we're just supposed to act like nothing happened? Like, this is crazy. So I think with Skyler, when losing Skyler, what I realized is I had a lot of stored grief that hadn't been felt or processed that came out with the grief of Skyler. And so when Skyler died, it was a grief you couldn't ignore, right? It was like that life-shattering, altering grief that just like breaks your heart into a million pieces. And then you're left thinking, how in the world am I going to put these pieces back together again? But the beautiful thing that I've learned through all the griefs is that oftentimes when your heart breaks into a million pieces, you get more pieces to rebuild something back. And so, with every heartbreak that I've allowed myself to enter into and to experience, like I find that, more pieces get slipped in than were originally there. And so it's like you build back something, but it's not returning to who you were before, because that's impossible. It's like, how do I take this, build something new and better and whole that encompasses and integrates this past experience into who I am, because I'll never be Ashley before Skyler, right? And nor would I want to be.
Yeah.
So I think that that's really like, when I think about grief and grieving, it was like I was so depressed. I was so just questioning everything, right? My identity as a mom was gone. I had been a full-time mom and caregiver for 2 years. And so then it was like, what do I do with myself? Do I go back to the corporate world? Do I want that? What does my life look like now? And then it was kind of like, just figuring out, how do you process these feelings and these emotions, and how do I was 27 when she died, and I was 25 when I had her, 27 when she died. And I was like, wow, I'm 27. And if I can't figure out this healing journey right now, I'm going to be miserable the rest of my life. And that's hopefully a long time that I want to enjoy life. Like, I want to have good, loving relationships. I don't want to be this angry, old, bitter asshole. It's like,
Yeah.
I don't want to be the person that everyone runs away from because they're like, oh, she lost her daughter. Just, she's an old hag over there. It was like, how do I really allow myself to feel and experience and heal so that I can be a kind, loving person that potentially could help others?
A phrase that comes to mind that I learned recently is that we have to learn how to grieve well, which sounds like an oxymoron. But the reality is you're going to grieve regardless of whether or not whether you recognize it or not.
Yeah,
So you can choose to grieve well by experiencing all the highs and all the lows, the lowest of lows that exist,
that's
because
right.
you have to. That is actually what grieving well looks like, so that you can experience life more fully, and you can enjoy and be the version of a different version of yourself, but a version for others to enjoy, because you've actually taken the time to accept the sadness, the anger, the frustration, the jealousy, all of the things that I would imagine come with losing a precious child.
Yeah. And, I know you just gave a TEDx talk. In my TEDx talk, I say this phrase, which is, to heal, we have to grieve. To grieve, we have to feel. And to feel, we have to be present, especially in the pain, right? And our society is trained to reward us for checking out and distracting ourselves and avoiding pain. And like, we live in a world full of noise. And so to be present with what we're feeling, I think, is one of the most challenging things we have in this society as humans to do. It's like, and there's no like productivity in grief, right? Grief is a state of being. So it's like, you just have to be. It's not like you have to do anything. And that's hard for people.
It's hard, and I think what you just said is so important. You can't cut the corner. Like, your emotions are going to eventually catch up, and you have to sit in that. And again, I don't come at this from an experience like you, and I've learned so much from women like you and from your story. And again, I think it's so much easier said than done. It's like, of course you're supposed to be sad. It's like, no, no, no. But like, do you know how to sit in sadness? And really have to sit in it without creating an excuse or an opportunity to leave and distract yourself. Again, we also live in a country where you're rewarded for being busy, right? Think of the algorithms we use and all the social media channels. Like, we are rewarded to keep going and to go as fast as we can, to distract, distract, distract. And so it's like our values and our systems are at odds with one another.
Absolutely.
And I know that you're very passionate and focused on changing that. I wanna actually ask you a little bit more about Memento and the opportunity that you saw there to help people that were in the anticipatory grief that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. So when I was grieving with Skyler, one of the things, a friend had gifted us a professional portrait session. And I had these photos around our house. And as a photographer myself, I had them framed and hung everywhere in the house. And the day after she died, I actually went around the house and turned them all face down because it felt so incredibly painful to see them and know that she wasn't alive, and that like I would never be able to hold her again or like experience her life again. And yet, like, days go by, weeks start to go by, and it's like dang, I just miss her so much. And so I started turning these photos back up one by one around the house. And then I found myself sitting with them and just ugly crying, right? Just like snot pouring out of my face, like sounds that would probably scare off most normal friends. And so I was like, oh, this is such a freeing place to let it all out. And then there would be days where I would just go into her room and there would be the photo on the bookshelf and I would say, good morning, sweet girl, right? How I would always greet her. And I found that photos just gave me this way to not only process and feel and be present with what emotions were coming up, but it also gave me this way to connect with her and continue that bond, and really have that direction for my love to go. So that's really what led me to start offering free portrait sessions to anyone facing a terminal diagnosis, because I was like, well, if the photos really helped me, I'm a photographer, I can do that for other people. And this was before I knew there was any science and research-based backing on photography and photographs being a support tool. So it's just kind of like my own personal experience and hypothesis. I was like, I'll do it. And everyone took me up on it. So if I heard of someone, I'd offer them a session and they'd take me up on it. I do the session, give them really beautiful prints. And it was so powerful because every family had a different story of how the photos impacted them. And so my husband lovingly was like, please stop giving it all away. Like, we have our own bills to pay. We're still struggling to recover financially. I love you and your giving heart, but you got to stop. And I was like, I hear you, but I'm also not going to stop. I'll find a way. And that's really how I started the 501c3, because I was like, if I'm willing to give it all away, I believe I can find other people who really value photography and helping people in grief and see the need for this, who will help me give it all away. So it started as Love Not Lost. It's now Memento Foundation. And really our mission is to help people heal in grief. And so photography was the first way that we started. And then we've expanded through community support and then also corporate care. So those are our three main programs for supporting people in all stages of life and all walks of life. So, people say, oh, your personal life and your work life. And it's like, when tragedy strikes, you have one life, right? You can't keep work and personal separate. It's like, we have one life. And so we need to be supported in all areas of our life. And so we try and do that. We show up for people with photography. We try and empower the community and create helpful resources to know how to support yourself and others. And then bring grief and empathy training to the workplace.
One thing I love about what you do and what I've learned from some of your families as well is that, a professional photography session, when you have a loved one with a terminal illness, at first you might say, well, why would I want that? I never want to think about them sick. I never want to, I don't want to remember this. And what I think people miss and what they don't realize is that people are still living. They're still there. And over time, even once that person eventually passes, you miss out on that opportunity to really cherish that person as they were, because it is certainly just this one particular season.
Right.
And I've just heard such incredible feedback about what you offer, because when ultimately that time comes, it becomes a cherished part of their journey.
Yeah.
And really, it honors them. It's not to say that this version of them is the best version, but it just
No.
shows that we love this person through all of it, because again, this is like our nature, right? We want to skip over the hard. It's like we can't.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, these pictures allow people to like sit in that hard for just enough time to accept it, because you're not going to move to quote the next step in your grief without accepting the reality that you already went through. And I just think there's such power in that. And I know obviously you have all the science on it, but I even just anecdotally from what I've heard, I think it's so powerful.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really special too, because, obviously we try and capture people when they're first diagnosed so they still feel good. We can get out and make memories together somewhere fun, and we try and coordinate things that have meaning,
Right.
for the families. But even in the later stages, if someone's on hospice and they can't leave their house or even their bed, right? Our photographers are trained to kind of create these really special emotional moments for people to say, you know what, for just a minute, step in close, hold each other the way that you would normally hold each other. Forget that I'm here. Take some deep breaths together and just sit in the love that you share, right? And then we'll be capturing it around them. And like sometimes we'll just get close-ups of hands, so that even if someone isn't really the way you want to remember them, you still have some details that are them and that capture that emotional connection that you had, because that's the hope. It's like, we don't want you to look at the photos and think back to like, oh yeah, remember that photographer? Like, well, like we want you to look at those photos and say, oh man, I remember the way they smelled in that moment. And like, I remember their, the warmth of their embrace and their hug, and like, oh, it just felt so good, right? Like that's what we're trying to capture in a way that's going to bring that support and that love and connection back for someone, even 10, 20, 40 years later.
Yeah. So Ashley, you are so busy with Memento, certainly, and I know you have more to give, more to share. Do you mind giving people a teaser of what's to come here in the next few months?
Sure. So, yeah, I managed to write a book that is a trauma-informed survival guide to loss. The title is When You Can't See the Light, and it's designed to be a day-by-day support for people who have just suffered a significant loss. And, part of why I wrote it was because I was not finding anything like it in the last 10 years. Like, I really didn't want to write a book. Like, it is a huge undertaking, one that I honestly just didn't have time for. Like, you can ask, like, for the last year, I've had no friends. um, it was like, all my waking moments that I had extra time for were spent writing. Really, it's to give people this full experience very intentionally in the space of raw grief. So when I was looking for resources for myself, people would tell me, oh, you might feel this, or someone might say this horrible thing to you, or you might expect this, but no one told me what to do, right? Like,
And
what do I do with that? When someone says something awful to me, how do I respond? Like, if I do feel this, what do I do with that?
right.
So I could never find the doing. And I know I said grief is a state of being, but there are things you can do in the mindful presence of grief. And what I was seeing over the last decade were people who just never had the education, didn't know what to do, people who didn't know what to say. And then for I started meeting families that truly had no support system. So it was like, looking for books, looking for help, looking for education and resources, but no one else was showing up for them. So it was like, how can I, Ashley, walk myself through grief if I have no friends and family who are here to support me? And so this book is really meant to be a hand holding, like, I am that friend showing up for you in this book to say, hey, today we're going to talk about breath work, right? I'm going to
Mm,
teach you some different breathing methods that can help support you through anxiety, through regulating your nervous system, through XYZ. The next day we'll talk about hydrating and making sure that you're fully hydrated, because crying takes a lot of, hydration. And our bodies are so full of water to be fully healthy. Like, we need to be hydrated. So just basic things to meet our needs. And then, and with the trauma informed too, we take a somatic approach. So really supporting our bodies first, and then moving into the head space and the emotional space. But it's also specifically broken up into very small digestible pieces. And that's why it's day by day, because in grief, like, we don't have time. Like, we can't even process like what we're having for dinner, let alone like taking in a full chapter. It's like grief brain is so real. And so I really wanted to create something. And the other kind of distinguisher of my book is that there's artwork woven throughout, because so many books are just black and white. And in grief, it's like, grief is not black and white. It is a full color experience. And really artwork speaks to that emotional soul side of us. Whereas black and white text is more in our cerebral head, right? And so it's like, how can I tie in and make an experience of reading this book to support people in their whole body experience, talking talking about not just hydration, but also, you know, breath work, lymph, our circulation, our posture, like how all of these systems in our body connect to help support us through healing and health and wellness.
Wow. It feels like such a valuable book, not just though for someone who's grieving, but someone who is supporting someone in grief, whether that be a professional in a hospital/hospice setting, whether that's a friend that's now playing the role of making sure their friend or family member is okay.
Yeah.
Do you think that there is that accurate?
Mhm.
Can there be value for multiple stakeholders beyond the person that's experiencing the firsthand grief?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I wrote it specifically as elementary as I possibly could to hopefully, like I said, one of my first big trauma griefs was high school, right? Like I wanted to write it so that a high schooler could pick it up and it would be like really helpful for them and they would understand it. I'm still wondering if like middle schoolers could get to it. Like I haven't done any like, once it's
That
out
would be
in the world.
book number 2.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, it's like I tried to write it as simply as possible. And again, because of the artwork and stuff, it's really designed to be a gift book too.
Then
So
yeah.
someone could read it and learn about grief and know how to show up and offer support. But you could also buy the book and just say, hey, I heard this book was really helpful. Here's this book. And if you want, I'll get a copy and we can go through it together. Right. That would be amazing if someone like could come and say, hey, today Ashley's talking about hydration. Like, how are you doing on drinking water? Like, do you need a different water bottle that might help you? Or like, how can you drink more water? Right. And so I think it could be a really, really beautiful support tool as well.
Ashley, as we wrap up here, I'd love to give you an opportunity to share where people can find you or more about Memento and all the just incredible resources you've provided.
Thank you. Yeah, so people can find me. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn as far as social media goes. I'm trying to do better on mental health and my own emotional capacity. So I am stepping away from other platforms right now. But LinkedIn, I'm still pretty active. And then Memento Foundation. So mementofoundation.org is the website. We are still on Instagram and Facebook right now. Again, still exploring what that looks like as we try and support people through their own health and wellness there. But yeah, I think those are kind of the main ones. Eventually, I will have a website for my book, and I'll have that under ashleynicolejones.com, but that's not up right now.
Yeah. So for anyone that missed it, the name of the book will be called "When You Can't See the Light," and so we'll make sure when we post this, once the book is live, to also have a link to that. So for anyone who's interested, Ashley, I just want to say thank you again for being open and sharing your story again. I know it never gets easier to talk about Skyler, and I do hope it always feels good to tell the world about who she is or who she was, and for to allow you to keep shining light on behalf of her. So thank you for joining us today. And as always, look forward to future conversations with you.